When we talk about running related injuries, we often gravitate towards and think more so about musculoskeletal injuries, but this isn't always the case. Blisters are actually the most common running related injury reported, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, in saying that, I would love to welcome the authority on blisters, that is Rebecca Rushton, aka the Blister Pod. So, welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks for having me, Talisha. It's lovely to be here.
I've been looking forward to this for so long. It's very keen to talk about all things blisters because even in my clinical practice with the amount of athletes and runners that I deal with, blisters are actually one of the biggest areas of frustration that I encounter as a clinician. And over the last few years, the more I've been sort of following your work and discovering what you've been doing, and now that you've got a couple of papers that are coming out or have been released, it's just absolutely blowing my mind how much that there is to know about blisters, and then also how much many of us as clinicians, myself included, don't know about them. So very much appreciative of your work. And again, thank you for joining us. The Progressive Podiatry Project, here to share knowledge, insights and information for you to improve your clinical practice and, most importantly, help you help your clients. So just a little bit of would you be able to give us a little bit of background on you and how, like, your clinical practice and how you kind of gravitated into and becoming essentially a master of the blister space?
Yeah, sure. Well, I've been a podiatrist for 30 years now, and for 15 of those years, I've really been looking closely at blisters. And it all came about because I'm relatively blister prone myself. And in 2008, things just came to a head, and I was getting these posterior heel blisters that just wouldn't resolve. And, this was just on my morning walks, morning half-hour walks with the dog. It was quite ridiculous. So it was then that I sort of had to, I just decided this is ridiculous, because everything in my podiatry training and 15 years experience wasn't helping me get on top of this issue for my own feet. So I knew that there was something not quite right, and it all started from there. So yeah, that was 15 years ago in 2008. I started learning stuff, and in 2012 I started the blister prevention website, which I kind of learned by writing things down. And so I was writing all this stuff down, and I was chucking it up on the website, because I just knew that there would be other people out there wanting to know this stuff, and not necessarily podiatrists so much than just, individuals. So that's how it all started, and it's just steamrolled from there. And now I've got a couple of courses where I teach podiatrists. I've also got a little course called Fix My Foot Blisters Fast, which a lot of people in the general public join and learn about how to tackle their blisters, like runners that are training for an event and that kind of thing. And most excitingly, I've just published those 2 papers with Doug Ritchie in the Journal of Athletic Training. So that's really quite a thrill for me.
Oh, and huge kudos, because I'm yet to have any work published, but from what I can understand, it's a little bit of a process. And yeah, how have you found the whole process from going from having these conceptual ideas to being a published author?
Well, as I said before, I'm not an academic in any way, shape, or form. So,
Yeah.
but I knew that the peer review process was going to be pretty hardcore, and it was. Even with having Doug on board, I mean, I wouldn't have been able to do it without him. So it was certainly a team effort. Yeah, I've just known for many years that there's something in this. There's something in this that people aren't aware of. There's so many misconceptions, and they're easy mistakes to make, and they took me a long time to get my head around. So it was probably in 2020, late 2020, early 21, that I just, it was getting worse. Like in the academic literature, the people were writing about blister management, or blisters in general, and they were using the term friction, but they were using it in a way that they were meaning the lay definition of friction, which is rubbing. But when we talk about friction in friction blisters, it's the scientific definition we need to use, which is the resistance of 2 things moving against one another. So it's the force that resists movement. So you can see that those two definitions are actually more dissimilar than they are similar. And I spoke to Doug. I emailed Doug. I'm not sure I'd even talked to him. I'm not sure we even communicated before that time. But I was just like, look at this, Doug. It's just unbelievable. Because I knew Doug knew his stuff. He did the two SOC research papers in the early 1990s with Kirk Herring. And he also wrote a paper in Podiatry magazines in 2010, which I just loved. It was just a general overview of blister management. And he was talking about the cause of blisters, and he mentioned something about the skin and bone moving out of sync. Now, when I read that, I thought, what's he on about? That's the weirdest thing I've ever heard anyone say about what causes blisters. But it wasn't long after that it twigged that the reason I was having so much trouble was I couldn't get my head around the fact that it's not rubbing, it's the force that resists rubbing. So the bones are moving in, the skin's staying still, and everything in between is stretching and distorting, and that's shear deformation, and that's what causes the mechanical fatigue in the epidermis. And went on from there.
That's very interesting. And we will certainly unpack that. Rebecca, before we dive too much further into all of the elements of blisters and blister prevention, given that yourself and Doug have both published two papers, one especially that's sort of giving us a bit of a critical review on the current evidence and practice of preventing blisters or managing blisters, where does the evidence currently sit in regards to all the different blister prevention strategies that clinicians commonly utilise?
Yeah, this might surprise most of your listeners, Talisha, but we've only got evidence for 3 prevention strategies. The first one is adaptation. So that is the training that we do to our skin to afford those positive adaptations within the epidermis. So we know that helps prevent blisters to a certain degree. We have evidence for neoprene insoles, which is basically Spenco insoles. Yep. That research was done back in the late 1960s, and there's been nothing since then. And we have evidence for dense padded acrylic socks. And this is the research that Doug Ritchie did in the early 1990s. So they did two research papers. And the first one was they looked at 2 socks of identical construction. One was 100% acrylic, the other was 100% cotton, and they found that the acrylic outperformed the cotton. So with the cotton socks, there were, I think it was twice as many blisters, and the blisters were 3 times the size compared to acrylic. And so they assumed that that must be the moisture management component of the acrylic fibers. And then they repeated the same research, but this time they used thin socks. So again, identical construction. One was 100% acrylic, one was 100% cotton, and there was no difference between the blister situations. So it was the denseness or the thickness or the padding of the acrylic that was the thing that did the job. So it wasn't necessarily the acrylic just as a material, it had to be thick. So it could be a moisture management thing. It could be a padding thing. Who knows? We don't really know exactly. We can only just kind of think about what the potential is. So that's what the evidence that we do have as it stands. We have evidence against both powders and antiperspirants. So powders, there's either no evidence or the evidence is that it makes blisters worse. And we're talking about talc and starch powders.
Yep.
And with antiperspirants, so there was research done in the military many years ago, and they found that there were some antiperspirants that definitely reduced blister incidence, but at the same time they caused contact dermatitis. So much so they weren't worth using. So what they did was they applied some emollient component to the antiperspirant to try and negate the dermatitis, and it did negate the dermatitis, but it no longer had a blister prevention effect. So as it stands, there's no evidence for antiperspirants.
And that is an interesting one, because I know I've done quite a number of, this is years ago when I had my clinic, I had a few trail runners that came in before some ultra events, and that was one of their strategies. So the and this is where I first started learning about blisters, but granted, didn't advance my knowledge to the extent you have, and this is why I still have a knowledge gap. But yeah, a lot of these trail runners were coming in and they were using tape and antiperspirants. They were kind of their go-to. And then the other one was the lathering the entire foot with Vaseline.
Mm.
So that's interesting that there's, yeah, no actual evidence to support that. And are there any areas or interventions where it's a little bit of a mixed bag as far as some evidence or conflicting evidence exists?
Yep, two strategies. One is paper tape. So there's two studies. One showed that it didn't work. The other showed it did work. And they were very similar studies on similar groups. That, like, it was ultra marathons. So it was the same group of races. So we're not quite sure about paper tape. Could go either way. And there's been 3 studies on double socks, and that really showed conflicting information. And it's probably understandable because there was such a variation in the material nature of the socks that there was nothing found there that we could hang our hat on. And it's definitely surprising that there's a lot of common sense approaches that absolutely have no evidence for example, shoe fit. So we don't actually know that if you wear a shoe that fits perfectly, whether it will prevent blisters. We assume that it does, and I'm sure it does to a certain degree, or in as much as a shoe that's too tight or even too big is probably going to contribute to blisters in some way. So there's nothing for footwear fit, there's nothing for lubricants, and heaps of runners use lubricants.
Yeah.
So I'm sure it works to a degree. There's definitely downsides to lubricants, but a lot of runners get good effect with lubricants. And when you were talking about the lubricants and tape and what was the other one, powder or something?
Yeah.
A lot of people
antiperspirants, sorry.
Antiperspirants, yeah. Some people will do something, so they'll implement a prevention or an array of preventions, and then they won't get blisters, and they'll just assume that it's worked. Well, look, they might have not got blisters in spite of those preventions.
Yeah.
So, and then at the same time, when you think about taping works fine for a lot of people. But for someone who's particularly blister prone or has a specific anatomical or functional predisposition to a blister at a particular site, taping won't work. So it all depends on where we sit on the blister resistance continuum. So like I'm at the blister prone end of things, and a lot of people are lucky enough to be at the blister resistant end of things. So yeah, it's difficult because there's, you've got to apply it to the individual. Basically, we've got to use our informed clinical reasoning to apply the right strategy with an understanding of how it works and its pros and cons to the individual and their specific biomechanics, structure, all that kind of stuff. But moving on from there, so we've got nothing for footwear fit, nothing for lubricants. We've got no evidence for any other tape. A lot of people don't use paper tape. So, it'd be great to know about Fixamal or zinc oxide tape, rock tape. These are the tapes that runners are using. Interestingly, a lot of tapes are made out of cotton. Cotton, we know, has poor moisture management capabilities. So there's even the potential that tapes could make things worse.
Yeah, because that's one of the like moisture, and that alters the friction.
Yes, you're holding the moisture at the skin surface type of thing. So conceivably, it could actually make things worse. Plus, you've got the bulk of it and all that. So yeah, nothing for those sort of tapes. There's nothing for toe socks. A lot of runners use toe socks. A lot of hikers use toe socks. I find toe socks can work great, but certainly doesn't work for every toe blister. And when you think about toe socks, this is something to help your patients out. I mean, I get emails from patients and from just the general public, and they'll say, oh, well, I'm not going to get this blister on the tip of my toe because I'm wearing toe socks. Well, the toe sock is no different than a normal sock for the tip of the toe. Toe socks are only effective for the interdigital space. Yeah. So normally it's skin on skin. Now we've got skin, sock, skin. So we've got it like padding, so cushion, pressure management, and we've also got like a double sock mechanism. But all of those extra sock layers take up a lot of room, and if you use them in ultramarathon, there are times when things just don't fit. People cutting shoes open at the toes and all sorts of crazy stuff.
Yeah, I've seen some shoes that are post ultra and they've been completely butchered.
Yeah.
So for that strategy, like if we're having blisters that occur at the apices of the digits, so would that be more so relating to biomechanical loads and even the function, well, digital purchase and the
Yes.
function of the flexor digitorum longus and all of those anatomical? So it's a more of biomechanical driver for those types of blisters potentially.
Y- Yes, it definitely can be. A lot of people that have apical blisters assume that it's their toes hitting the end of the shoe. That's rarely the case. We
Mhm.
do see it though in ultramarathon, because what they do is they get soreness where the laces are on the dorsum, and so they leave their laces loose, and then there's this big gap between the shoe and their heel, and their toes are like
Yes.
jammed up into a narrower and shallower part of the toe box. So you see it occasionally, but in the general population, it's rarely that the toes are at the end of the shoe. It's usually a clawed toe situation. So yeah, I do a lot of felt props to just get the apices off the stop the digits from clawing, get the apices off the floor, basically.
Yep. And that would be a topic that, so I know that both you and Doug, as far as being the brains trust for the blister papers that you've published, and I know Doug personally with his biomechanical and pathomechanical background. So would they be topics that might be worth putting a pin in and we can unpack with Doug when we do episode 2?
Oh, I think your listeners would love to hear from Doug about that kind of stuff. I don't know if you know, but he's written a textbook recently, last year or two, in his retirement, all about pathomechanical biomechanics and all that kind of stuff. So he's heavily into that, and I'm sure he'd love to chat about that more.
Yeah, I'd love to have him on because, fun fact, that was the last textbook that I bought. So
Oh, cool.
it's
He'll be thrilled.
yeah, I haven't actually told him that I've bought that yet, but yeah, that was actually the last textbook I bought at the end of last year, and yeah, quite. He's just an immense wealth of knowledge, so I am very much looking forward to having Doug on, but he's not here today, so we'll just keep cracking on with what we can pick your brain about.
Yeah, sure. Some other things that we don't have evidence for: engo patches, something I rely on personally and definitely in ultramarathons. You know, a lot of these strategies, including the engo patches or the PTFE, which is polytetrafluoroethylene patches, they have some really great laboratory data on coefficient of friction, but nothing in the real world. So it would be great to see some sort of research on those. There's nothing for the gel toe devices, and there's nothing at all for any biomechanical intervention in regard to blister management. So there's so much room for more research to be done here. Yeah, it's unbelievable.
It and that's I think it's kind of gives it, so even though we know that there's rather immense gaps in our knowledge space, it's a good paper. We leave the paper with having some room for asking more questions and more areas to explore. So I feel that yeah, we'll definitely get Doug to talk to it, because just because we don't, this is my opinion, just because the evidence isn't there and it doesn't exist doesn't mean that it's not a valid reasoning. So like talking about the orthomechanical interventions and the pathomechanics that contribute to blister formation, it's like, especially having Doug's insight into this area, like there's very much likely a relatable link there, but we just aren't aware of it. Would that be a correct assumption?
Yeah, we just don't have the research, but that doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just hasn't been done yet.
So it's very much, it's that whole kind of evidence informed practice. So drawing on the best available evidence, but then also combining that with our clinical experience. And that's sort of where we blend the art and the science of dealing with humans. And
Yeah, and definitely with blisters, it's understanding what causes blisters, because if you're coming at them from the wrong angle, you'll never get anywhere. So we understand what causes blisters. We can see from that all the ways we can prevent blisters, and then we just have to apply it to the individual in regard to their particular function and structure and
yep.
activity.
Well, that's a very good point. So what we might do now is start picking your brain and unpacking some of the causative mechanisms and what we can actually do about it.
Great.
There's obviously a lot of misconceptions that we, even just from what you were alluding to or were mentioning with what was being reported in papers as far as the friction blisters and then what actually contributes to friction blisters from the actual mechanical standpoint. So would you be able to just cover off a little bit of the probably identified and current misconceptions that health practitioners have underlying, well, essentially what makes up the traditional blister causative paradigm and what's potentially wrong with our way of thinking in regards to that and what we're missing?
Yeah, for sure. Well, generally we think of heat, moisture and friction as in rubbing, which that really has us fixated on the use of tape, because when we tape the skin, nothing can possibly rub the skin. And so in 2008, when I was getting these blisters at the back of my heel, it was taped, my skin was taped, and still these blisters. And I'm like, what on earth is happening here? Like, I just couldn't get my head around what was going on. So that is why taping is not the be all and end all. A lot of our patients are out there getting blisters in spite of taping. But, you know, me, myself, back in 2008, you know, and that kind of era, when I had a patient come in for blisters, I would tell them how to tape. And so you can imagine the conflict, the internal conflict. So, yes, blisters are not a superficial to deep wear injury. If they were, calluses would be a good idea. But, you know, if a superficial to deep wear injury is an abrasion, essentially. Okay, so skins like the corneum is rubbing off to deeper and deeper layers until it gets down into the deeper epidermis. That's what an abrasion is. That's not what a blister is. A blister is an intraepidermal tear at the stratum spinosum caused by this repetitive shear deformation. And once there's that tear there, it takes about 2 hours or up to 2 hours for the blister to fill with fluid and actually look like a blister.
Okay, so instead of it being what we'll often think of superficial or deep, it's almost the opposite, where it's a little bit deeper and then it rises to the surface, so deep to superficial.
Yeah, and what it helps to think about is bones move, skin stays still, everything in between stretches and distorts.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like a wearing down to progressively deeper layers.
And so with that, what you're describing, and you did mention it, is shear forces. Now, just sort of taking the next step in this educational pathway or journey that we're taking with you. Now, I do love a deep dive into physiology and functions. So my wheelhouse is collagenous structures, but mostly tendons and fascia. And we know that tendons and fascia, they're subjected to tensile forces, shearing forces, bending forces, compressive forces. And I think it's easy for us to forget that the skin is also a collagenous structure. So when we think about the function of collagenous fibers, and that's to essentially store, transmit, dissipate energy during mechanical loading or deformation, does blisters and the skin follow that typical pathway that we are aware of that tendons and fascia follow as well when it comes to mechanical related injuries?
I think so. Not being an expert on tendinopathy and all of the rest of it, like you are, but essentially the skin does adapt to shear load. So one of the ways that we help prevent blisters is to take advantage of those positive structural adaptations within the skin. So basically, skin will toughen to a degree as you subject it to the loads that threaten to damage it. And when we're rehabbing tendons, that's what we're doing. We're increasing it very sort of progressively so that we can give the structure time to create those positive adaptations. Well, the same things happen in the epidermis. So they had the study that comes to mind was they rubbed a mouse ear or several mouse ears once a day, and they measured the changes in the epidermis at 7 days, 14, 21, and 28 days. And they actually found that the positive adaptations were similar at 7 days as they were at 28 days. So potentially skin adapts much quicker than tendons. Again, this is mice ears, so I'm not sure if we can like extrapolate it directly across. Yeah. But yes, definitely training is an important part of blister prevention. Like, you don't just get off the couch after 6 weeks of an injury and go for a 25K run, because you're probably not going to go well, in not just skin wise, but also tendon wise and muscle wise and all the rest of it. So when we're training for, let's say, a marathon or a hike, we're increasing our loads. We're thinking, oh yeah, we're training our aerobic system and the musculoskeletal system, but inadvertently you're also training the skin.
Yep. And so with speaking to that, with the adaptation and the progressive loading, so as far as the development of that that's superficial to deep.
The intraepidermal tear?
That's it, thank you. See, still heaps I need to learn and memorise. So with the development of that, would it be quite similar to musculoskeletal tissues, where we have our sort of current capacity, and then once we have applied mechanical loads exceeding that capacity, that's essentially what leads to the development of this? So, and that would be arguably why you're saying that the progressive introduction to loads will contribute to it. So it kind of sounds like it does follow almost the typical injury mechanism as far as applied loads, and exceeding current capacity. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. But I think with tendons, it's you just progressively keep loading, and unless you're doing really silly things, your tendon and other collagenous structures will kind of adapt and keep adapting until you're like, it's unbelievably adapted. But with skin, it kind of only can go so far. So if you think about my heel blisters in 2008, I was doing this half an hour walk every morning. It wasn't like I was, doing anything extreme. I'd like to think that my capacity to deal with those shear loads was maxed out. All the adaptions, there was nothing else to come from it. But that's not to say that there's nothing you can do. There's a ton of things that you can do to minimize the shear load in the skin.
Okay, so in saying that, we've reached our ceiling of adaptation, but we're still having blisters occurring. So that sounds like there's a few other pieces of the puzzle that come into play. So given that you've highlighted that there are some misconceptions about what we traditionally think causes blisters, and then essentially this new paradigm that evidence and the work from yourself and Doug are putting forward as far as what actually contributes to blisters, what elements comprise this new paradigm that's being proposed for the causative mechanisms of blisters?
Well, essentially, blisters are caused by repetitive shear deformation. Okay, so there's the repetitive part to it. So if we think about what it means for blister prevention strategies, we can just affect fewer repetitions. Now, for a runner, that just means not running as far. So that's not really helpful to anyone. The second thing we can do, is we can look for those adaptions, and we get those in training. There's nothing really specific that we need to do to affect those positive adaptions in the skin to make it more resilient to shear load. Just as long as we're gradually progressing, we're getting used to the activity, the shoes and socks, etc. So the foot is used to everything that's going on, terrain, climate, and all that. And once we've done those two things, then we're relying on strategies that reduce the magnitude of the shear load. So if we talk about shear and shear deformation, it helps to it helps me anyway, to kind of feel what that shear is all about. And when we think about magnitudes, of course, we want smaller magnitudes because the skin's able to deal with it more. So the way I like to do that is to get your fingertip of your right index finger, and put it on the back of your left hand, and keep it stuck to that same bit of skin and wobble it back and forth. So what's going on in the skin and soft tissue on the back of your hand is shear deformation. So if you press much lighter, you'll see that the fingertip slides across the back of the hand before shear deformation really builds to any degree. Okay, so just by reducing pressure, we've reduced shear load magnitude.
Yep.
We can also do things like use something that reduces the coefficient of friction. So we make things more slippery. So if we put a big blob of Vaseline there and we did the same thing, we press really hard, you would see that you wouldn't get shear deformation like that. It would be more like that because it's all slippery slidey.
Yep.
So yeah, we're trying to reduce shear load magnitudes by several ways. Shall I go into those?
I think we should, because I do have some questions relating to that. Now, I know we are going to do a second episode where we're going to have Doug join us. Just unfortunately, he couldn't be with us today. Now, I do have one question for you in relation to that, because I know that, like, when it comes to sort of performance and us actually running and increasing speed, like we don't want to dissipate and lose as much energy. The more energy that can be stored and returned within our bodies, that leads to sort of faster running times, improved performance. So if we're increasing the sliding from using external lubricants, does that have a deleterious impact on performance because we are actually losing some of that?
Yes, it does. We rely on traction for the efficiencies of gait. So it's not a good idea to put Vaseline over your whole foot or any friction management strategy over your whole foot because it retards, propulsive push off and changes of direction and braking forces and all that kind of thing. So yeah, I'm a big fan of we need really good friction management strategies, as in coefficient of friction, to make things more slippery, but we only need to apply them to where they're needed, where the blister susceptible area is. And mechanisms that use the reduced coefficient of friction mechanism, some of them work better than others. So Vaseline obviously theoretically works really well, even though we've got no evidence for it. Theoretically and intuitively works really well, and we just have to keep reapplying it.
Yep.
But another moisture management strategy, another coefficient of friction management strategy is all the moisture management strategies. So for example, moisture wicking socks. Now, moisture wicking socks are looking to get rid of the moisture to make the skin a lower friction level, the skin sock interface at a lower friction level to make it more slippery slidey. But intuitively, it doesn't make it that slippery slidey, does it? So to my way of thinking, moisture management strategies like moisture wicking socks, they have a small effect on coefficient of friction.
Yep.
And a lot of people think, oh, I've got great socks, why am I still getting blisters? Well, that's because it doesn't actually reduce coefficient of friction much. It's a good place to start. If you're not particularly blister prone, that might be all you need. But it's important that we still have the high friction is actually important to and necessary for every step that we take. So at the skin, like on the plantar surface of our foot, it's hairless. There's a high proportion of eccrine sweat glands, and it's ridged, and all of these things increase friction levels. So it's by design that the plantar surface of the foot exhibits a high friction level when it's interfaced with basically anything.
Built-in traction, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. It needs it for traction. Yeah. So when we are trying to reduce the coefficient of friction and make things more slippery, especially on the bottom of the foot, we have to do it in a targeted way.
Okay, so and just to clarify for the listeners, so with the coefficient of friction, a low coefficient of friction means that there's more sliding, there's less traction. Yep.
Yes.
And would it follow a little bit of a bell curve as far as sort of your optimal level? Like if you have too high of a coefficient of friction, that's not great. And if it's too low, that's also not great. So it's finding that happy medium.
I'd be more just apply it to where you need it. Friction and traction is necessary. Leave it as it is until you've got a problem somewhere, i.e. blister prone area, deal with it right there. That's how I do it.
Yep, that's a good approach. Now, I think because, again, Doug's not with us today, and from what it sounds like, there's quite a multifaceted element that contributes to the development of blisters. And there's a few different, so if we're looking to manage blisters, like in your situation where it was quite a long-term scenario, would it be quite similar to other musculoskeletal pathologies where we have our sort of short-term management strategies and then our sort of longer-term management strategies? So say we're dealing with like plantar fasciopathy, for example, and we've got someone that's got a reactive flare and we're needing to address the symptoms there and then to kind of help with their returning to activities of daily living, but then we identify what their contributing risk factors are and have a more long-term strategy for the addressing of their actual underlying problems. Is that quite similar to blisters in the sense that when you have someone presenting with blisters, or if they've got a running event coming up, there might be some more shorter term managements that you do, and then there's potentially longer term approaches?
Yeah, absolutely. So like when I'm at races, I like to go to the 6-day ultra marathon races because blisters are like a massive issue there. And that's kind of where I've honed my skills in finding out what works and all that kind of stuff. I've got the athlete right there and they're day 2 on a 6-day race. So they've got 4 days of running to go. I've got to implement something that's going to be beneficial but have no downsides. Mm-hmm. So I don't really want to be mucking around with their biomechanics too much in case it's too much to handle considering they're halfway through a race. So I guess my focus has been necessarily while I'm at these events and doing blister care is I'm really just looking to find the best thing to minimize those shear distortions. And then I like to educate the athlete to say, look, this is probably what's going on. You should probably see your podiatrist and follow up for the next race that you run because this is going on, that's going on. So it could be, let's say, a good example is actually blisters under the first MPJ. Okay, mm-hmm. So there's different potential mechanisms for that blister. So let's say the athlete has got a rigid forefoot valgus. Mm-hmm. So or plantar flex first ray. So the predominant component there, right, is going to be pressure. Okay, so there's going to be high pressure of that metatarsal head, and it's going to be causing a lot of shear deformation because of the pressure. But let's say the person has a relatively flexible anterior cavus, forefoot equinus. So the predominant mechanism there is bone movement. So the forefoot loads, there's arch flattening, and so you can see that the metatarsal heads are rolling forward, and imagine the skin surface is staying stationary. Yep. So it's rolling forward. So in the plantar flex first ray that's kind of stiff, you want to do different things to if it is a compliant first ray arch flattening kind of a thing. And again, if there's an abductory twist, that's a different thing altogether. So it helps to really understand what's going on with the bone. The bone movement is what drives shear deformation. Just take it for granted that the skin is staying stationary. That's necessary. That's just the way it is. It's purposely the case. And just understand what's going on with the bones, as in bone movement.
And that's when I was reading the papers that you shared with me, that was where it really illuminated me to how much I don't know about blisters, because like you explaining it as succinctly as you have, it makes perfect sense. And especially when I think about my mechanics, my plantar flex first. And that, I guess, it also makes sense to what you were talking about, how it's not just we have the shear, but then we also have the magnitude, so the ground reaction forces and the pressure for it. So short term, so we're dividing it into, say, acute and chronic management, because Doug will join us for the chronic management. So acutely, if you have someone that with those 3 different sort of foot profiles you were discussing, in an acute management scenario, say you've got someone with a road race, or it's the first time you've seen them in the clinic and it's quite a sore blister, is there any sort of difference in the short-term strategy that you would apply to those different mechanical variables, or does that all fall into the sort of longer term orthomechanical?
I think it's probably more relevant to the longer term biomechanical interventions that you perform outside of the race. Mm-hmm. In the race, I'm really focused on I don't want to add any more bulk to the shoe, because running for 6 days, really, there's a swelling component, and
Oh,
there,
yes.
yeah, and you really are limited with what you can get in the shoe. So I'm looking to especially do things like reduce the coefficient of friction with something called Engo patches, which I'm kind of affiliated with, and they're just so handy because they take up no room in the shoe, and they reduce friction levels big time. They reduce the coefficient of friction. So I get get away with a lot of things with those patches. But there are other things that you can do. Let's say it's the outside of the little toe. Gel toe sleeves are fantastic. Now, what they do is they do cushion a little bit, but they absorb the shear. So the gel kind of undergoes the shear. So the foot doesn't have to, the skin doesn't have to.
Yes.
So I love gel toe devices. Not so good. And this is an important one. So when you're thinking about gel that really absorbs all that shear, the last thing you need, though, is a big insole of that gel material on the insole, and you can imagine what your foot would do. There's just no efficiencies of gait. It's like having Vaseline on your foot. So you have to kind of match the strategy to the anatomical location, and that's one thing I think we lack in as podiatrists, but particularly your general everyday person, is they just think blisters are a single problem. They're a single entity that requires a single solution, but you have to match the prevention to the anatomical location, because although every blister is caused by a repetitive shear deformation, there are different factors that are leading to that in terms of bone movement and pressure and all that kind of stuff.
Oh, and it very much, even though we think blisters are different to a lot of musculoskeletal pathologies, it just really follows the causative mechanism of MSK pathologies. It's so multifaceted. There's so many individual presenting risk factors that require their own unique management approach. And that's exactly what it's sounding like with blisters. So I know we're talking to the reducing the magnitude of shear distortions, and then we've got the reduction of bone movement, which again we'll talk about in another episode. So then there's the sort of shorter term ones. So we've spoken about the gel patches. Are there any other initial management approaches that you would use either within an event or sort of short term to help reduce the magnitude of the shear distortions occurring?
Oh, there's tons of things that you can do. I guess if I'm in a race, and if you think about an athlete that already has a blister, a lot of people just think, well, betadine and a Band-Aid type of thing, first aid. But to actually treat that blister properly so you can have that runner still run for days at a time, you have to implement the prevention as well. So blister treatment equals first aid plus blister prevention. That's a interesting component that we could teach our patients, that if you have a skin injury like a blister, don't just patch over it with a Band-Aid. Actually implement the prevention that you should have had in the first place, and you'll find that it's unbelievable that you can have, even with weight-bearing blisters, runners can just put their shoes on and go again, and they're just blown away with how not painful it is. So it's really important thing. Now, what was the question again? Short-term. So short-term things, like, I guess if we think about what I do in the race, I also do a few felt toe props. So for apical blisters, what we're just trying to prevent the apical pressure, and also the drawing of the apex of the digit back and forth on the shoe. So and I'm not doing Otiform K or anything. It's just a felt device. So, and I'll say, if this helps, see your podiatrist and they'll make you a longer term one, that kind of thing. I'll do some felt deflective paddings if I can get away with it in the shoe. What else do I do?
But I guess that sort of goes to what your consideration was of not wanting to increase the bulk within the shoe, especially during an event, because we've got the swelling component. So we don't always need to chuck a heap of felt in someone's shoe if they're mid-event.
No, you can't afford to. So you need to find other ways to reduce the magnitude of shear. So and most blister prevention strategies are looking to reduce shear load magnitudes. You can do it either by reducing bone movement, which we've kind of talked about. We're talking, toe props, orthoses, maybe calf stretches for how early the heel lifts at the back of the shoe, etc. Then we can use materials that absorb shear load. So that's the gel toe sleeves.
So the materials that have some give in
them. Have give in them, yeah. Spenco insoles is another example. Then we've got materials that spread shear load, and this is how tape works, in my opinion. There's not many other people that are kind of talking about this, but when you consider what causes blisters, it makes most sense that the way taping works, although we know it's not about how it stops rubbing on the skin, the way taping works is it spreads shear load such that it reduces the peak shear at the bony location. So if we imagine the back of the hand thing again, put a big bit of zinc oxide tape there, then do this again, and you'll see there's still shear load, there's still shear deformation going on within the skin on the back of your hand. So the tape doesn't negate shear load, but what it can do, because it's now pulling on that whole surface area of the tape, thereby spreading it, but reducing it at that particular anatomical site where you're getting a blister. Make sense?
That makes perfect sense, because that's very similar to how like a lot of the prescription of orthotic devices work, where it's just trying to spread the ground reaction forces over a greater surface area to decrease the peak load. So I'm actually loving, it's blowing my mind with how much I'm learning from you, because there's so many similar mechanisms, even though it's a different pathology and it does have its different drivers and different managements, it still follows a lot of the same principles of general musculoskeletal management, because again, we are dealing with collagenous structures in the human body.
Yeah, and when you think about blisters and bone movement and the biomechanics behind them, that's 100% podiatry, and yet we're not really tuned into that. Podiatrists and really everyone, but particularly podiatrists, that's our forte, is changing the way bones move, changing forces with orthotics and stretches and all the rest of it. So it's a component that we already know all the information. We just have to apply it to the blister situation. But we're so fixated on taping, we can't sort of get it. So that's really what we're trying to do with these papers, is get people thinking laterally, understanding, first of all, what causes blisters and what that actually means for all the ways we can prevent them.
And I think the work is fantastic. Like, I've really enjoyed reading both papers, and I was saying to you before we came on live that the second paper in particular, where you and Doug both unpack all of the different sort of treatment approaches, and just to give a bit of a critical appraisal, I need to read it probably 4 or 5 more times, because there's just so much quality information in there. And like, I know personally from myself, even just from the work that I haven't been working with you, but I've been reading your work. It's definitely given me a lot of ideas and insights into how I can improve my clinical practice. So I'm very appreciative of your contribution and Doug's contribution to this space, because I do feel that helping podiatrists, and not just podiatrists, anyone that deals with athletes, well, that doesn't have to be an athlete, anyone that gets blisters, basically, I think it will have, or has the potential to have, a profound impact. And that was one thing I wanted to ask you about, because as I've recently discovered, you are a fellow course creator. So is this, a lot of this, I'm assuming, is what you cover in your online course. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about your blister online course that you've released?
Yeah, it's called Blister Prevention University, and it really is about these papers. It covers all the same stuff, but in a more sort of succinct way, and per anatomical location. And then we talk about the strategies, the evidence behind them, the pros and cons, how they work, that kind of thing. So it's just dive in and go to whatever you want to learn about, and so you can just get to the information real fast. It's kind of really succinct as well. So I made that course with having a podiatrist in mind, with it open on their computer, their clinical computer, so that they could just jump into the information to figure out what to do with a blister. So it helps them, straight away. So yeah, it's been approved by the APOD, which is great. Yeah, I mean, lots of podiatrists have done it, and it's getting great, reviews.
Yeah, since I invited you to come on the podcast, there are a few podiatrists that I've spoken to that I know personally that have done your course, and I've only heard great things, and I'm about to sign up to it and get into it because I very much feel like it can help me clinically. So if people want to follow you on social media, would you just, social media and your website, would you just be able to give us a little bit of information of how people can find you?
Yeah, sure. I've got a website called blister-prevention.com, but we've also just released a podiatrist or professional website, which is pro.blister-prevention.com. So that's the one that we've really created for you guys, that we can really get into the nitty-gritty of blister management to upskill the whole profession and help our patients more with their blisters. Social wise, I'm on Facebook under Blister Prevention, Blister Pod on Instagram. I've got a YouTube channel, Blister Prevention. So yeah, I'm out and about there.
On all the spaces. I love it. So what we'll do to wrap this up, again, everyone, we're going to have Doug and Rebecca join us for episode 2 of this because there is so much for us to unpack, and I'm learning a lot, so I'm just being greedy, so I want to have them back on. But Rebecca, just based on what we've chatted about today, if you had some kind of clinical takeaways that you could give our listeners, just to summarize what you feel are the most salient points from our discussion, what would they be?
They would basically be, think of blisters as bones move, skin stays still, and everything in between stretches and distorts. That's repetitive shear deformation. That's what causes blisters. Try and get away from the fact that, try and get away from taping, and treat blisters according to their anatomical site. That's the most important thing. Don't just think of blisters as one pathology that needs a single solution. Think like a podiatrist about blisters. And if you think about it, calluses are very similar to blisters. They're caused by the same thing, repetitive shear deformation. Calluses are the chronic manifestation, blisters are the acute manifestation. So if you have a painful callus, what would you do for that? Well, do the same thing for a blister at that anatomical site.
Very good way to look at it, and very similar to I'll just sort of reflect back to my MSK background. So we've got our acute reactive tendinopathies and fasciopathies, and then we have our chronic long-term ones where it's a lot of the strategies are sort of centered around managing load. It's just what takes priority when we're triaging, if we're dealing with a more acute reactive versus chronic one. So I think that's a very good takeaway. Think like a podiatrist, basically.
Yeah, fancy that, hey?
Mind is blown. Well, thank you, Rebecca. I've really enjoyed today. I'm looking forward to the second episode. And basically, if everyone listening, you've been given Rebecca's contact information, but we also have her listed on our website, progressivepodiatryproject.com, and she'll be under the P3 Partners section, where we have a little collaboration with all of the like-minded health practitioners that contribute to the platform. So again, Rebecca, thank you for joining me. I've really, really enjoyed this, and yeah, looking forward to the next one.
Thanks, Talisha. It was a pleasure.
Cheers. See you guys.